So, okay. It was a long day of very interesting, really very interesting presentations and very heterogeneous presentations, so it's very difficult, of course, to unify all that. But I would maybe exercise my moderator's power, yes.
We never get rid of that.
Yes, as Tanya actually indirectly advised me to do. And so I begin with 3 questions that I address certain people, and then of my choice. And then I would move to the more general discussion, and we'll look what comes out of it. And one question is simply, that is the first one that I would like to address, is a question to what degree avant-garde is still a model for contemporary art. Yeah, in a sense in which some people say that it's our antiquity. Yeah, avant-garde is our antiquity. So we had a very long period of time, yeah, from Renaissance, actually to the end of the 9th century, where every new movement, every new gesture referred somehow to Greek antiquity, Greek-Roman antiquity, and was conceived as a revival of it. Even at the end of the 9th century, Nietzschean project was still a project of revitalization of Greek antiquity in the Dionysian terms. Yeah. So we had a very, very long period of history that referred to this point. And the question is, what happened? So it's obvious what happened, yeah. Industrial revolution happened, yeah. And so people simply realized it's not a model anymore. So they invented a new model, yeah, which is the avant-garde. Yeah. So the question is simply, do we have a feeling that we still live in the same paradigm? So we're still in the same paradigm in which we refer directly, indirectly, polemically, or in affirmative way or negative way to the avant-garde as something that remains relevant to us, or something happened to us or to society and to our life and to art and to whatever, yeah, that separated us from this time in the same way in which industrialization separated us from Greek-Roman antiquity. So is it the same paradigm? Should we think about avant-garde strategies as something that is immediately relevant to us, or something that is historically interesting but not immediately relevant? So I would begin by asking this question to Anton Vidocle and to Claire, and then because I asked Claire too this question, I just wanted pro domo sui to react to what she said, yeah, as kind of polemics about everybody's an artist, only indicating that, at least for me, everybody is an artist because everybody is not creative, and not because everybody is creative. So as long as you think, as long as you participate in the concept of progress, in the concept of accumulation, in the profit achievements, so on and so on, so it's this whole industry. It's of course not art, but the same activity has some dimension of senselessness. So the artistic reflection begins, and we know that with Duchamp and the Russian formalists, with defunctionalization. Yeah, we can speak about it in different terms, we speak about useful art, but it began in avant-garde with defunctionalization. That means that art begins where functionality, faith in the progress, faith in creativity product ends. So I don't want to expand on that, but I mean, there is a point I want to make. Yeah. And it's also, of course, there may be I did that also because, maybe one last remark, misusing the right of moderator. Of course, one of the fundamental problems of the avant-garde was a reaction to this industrial production of art and art-relevant projects and art-relevant products. So the question was, should we be resistant to that and create alternative? Or should we interpret this mass production in a different way? I think that, so not to oppose anything to it, but to undermine it by reinterpreting it in a completely different sense. And I think we have both strategies throughout the 20th century and maybe a mix of them. So I would begin with Anton, and then maybe Claire could react.
Well, it's been a really long day, and to be totally honest with you guys, I'm quite tired. So my answer will be maybe a little bit simplistic and short. It's a very simple answer, yes. I think we're still within, what I feel is that we're within the same paradigm. There has not been a significant enough shift for me to. But also, I just remembered that recently I was rereading T.J. Clarke, and the way he describes avant-garde, it's very interesting, as he suggests that the avant-garde was infected with the sickness of radicality, which actually maybe brings us back to, this idea of sickness that Boris was mentioning on the opening night here. So I think we're still infected with the sickness for now. It has not been cured.
But with the same virus. Yeah.
With the same virus, yes.
Okay, so, well, it should be clear from my talk that I want to defend an idea of art against this generic creativity that we're all invited to assume. In fact, we're required to assume. But avant-garde has the problem that it sounds a little bit nostalgic. It sounds a little bit romantic now. So the way in which I always rephrase it, especially to students, is to think of who is doing advanced research in your field. And if your field is contemporary art, I can see very clearly to me, like, who are the artists who are doing really advanced research with these areas about the intersection of the social and the artistic and the political. So maybe I wouldn't call it avant-garde, but I'm still very invested in those people who are working at that interface. And as I said, I think it is incompatible with mainstream mass creativity. And I think there is a difference, although I think a lot of work needs to be done in further defining what those differences are without coming back to very flat-footed declarations about art is this. It's much more about systems by which things get understood as art and institutionalized as art. What else was I invited to respond to there, Boris? Your elegant flip of art and creativity by just inverting the terms. I'm not.
Well, just you reacted to my lecture, and the idea was, of course, that to some degree we create something, we do something that does not have any response, that does not have any function, that does not succeed, that fails. That is superfluous. That makes no sense also because it is supposed to participate in kind of progress in which we do not believe, or a capitalist economy in which we also do not believe, and things like that. So what we will do with all this stuff, how we can manage it, and I think the good advice by some people at the beginning of the 20th century is to look at that as art. So that was my actually proposal.
Are you referring back to the Malevich quote from last night about incinerating the contents of museums?
But also, of course, Duchamp. What do you do with the toilet if with urine if you can use it?
I know exactly what we do with the toilet. Tanya has just done this. In Queen's Museum.
You can reuse it, of course.
Okay. She just disclosed something that's fine.
Oh.
That's fine.
Tanya, please.
I just put back the toilet in the toilet in the men's room.
Yeah, of course. That everybody wants to do. Actually.
So that's it. It's very simple.
That's the first idea. And actually also...
So when you pee, you can see the signature, but actually it's very weird because it's upside down. But it's useful and it's still beautiful. And I always had an urge to put Campbell's soup back to the supermarket, but I'm not sure you can still eat it. So
So that's a problem, of course, yeah. That's the first idea that you get here. No, Campbell, no, Manzoni. Manzoni it's interesting question because the general presupposition is that there's no murder artist here in it because he couldn't produce so much, yeah. And so in fact it's something completely different. It's also some kind of vegetables, I believe, or something like that.
But I just wanted to maybe add a footnote to this about functionalism, because I think there's a functionalist fallacy in circulation that a lot of discussion around 20th century art revolves about, well, is it functional or is it not functional? And I quite like to discard that, because it's what I'm detecting through Katerina, Anton, and me speaking today is about all of us are struggling to redefine some sense of autonomy that's not a modernist sense of autonomy, but whether Anton is calling this sovereignty or Katerina is talking about, I can't quite remember how you were phrasing it, but I sense we were very much in sync about what we're trying to defend a non-instrumentalized idea of art that nevertheless may still have a useful component, as Tanya's work demonstrates, but which isn't, but which gets around the kind of accusations that you often find in innumerable debates over the last decade when you present socially engaged or participatory art, where people say, yes, but what's it really changing? And you have this dogged repetition of this insistence that art has to be functional, when I think the dominant situation is that contemporary art is precisely required to be demonstrably useful and achieve things, at least if it's publicly funded in Europe.
I think the good question is, what is something that happens outside of art has really changed the society. So artists is accused not to change society, but who does? I mean, it's not clear. Yeah. Maybe go back to that, but I move to the second question, and that is my reaction to the question that was raised by Peter. Its relationship between a Russian and communist. So that if I understood in a right way, a successful Russian avant-garde was actually communist and non-Russian, and after it failed, it became to be Russian, something like that. Yeah. So that's a very interesting point, and I think it would be interesting to discuss that. So successful non-Russian, unsuccessful Russian. In a certain way, it presupposes that communism is must be by nature international. So recently, Badiou published a series of texts about that. Yeah, so return to universalism, return to internationalism. For example, the text "Communist Hypothesis," yeah, about return to the internationalist universalism. And he said that there are three predecessors of this return. Anti-nationalist return is the French Revolution, French Commune of the 19th century, and French movement of '68. So the question is, to what degree communism is really universal? Or the universalist from the beginning. I mean, we have Soviet communism, we had Cuban communism, we had Chinese, we had Yugoslavian, we had Korean, yeah, which is completely different. We have Eastern European countries that in many ways experienced communism simply as Soviet occupation, and there is a kind of tradition of association of communism with Soviet imperialism, and simply and so on and so on. So it's not, yeah, we have Euro-communism, we have Italian version, we have French version. So to what degree we can still speak about communism under this universal perspective? And if we cannot, and there is something like heterogeneity and multiplicity inside the communist project itself, and maybe from the beginning of it, then maybe we can we can relativize also this differentiation between purely successful international and deficient national. And actually, talking about Russian avant-garde was very nationalistic from the beginning. For example, during the World War I, all the avant-garde artists supported Russia in the war, and were not on an internationalist platform. And actually, Mayakovsky and many other people are making nationalist propaganda very much like communist propaganda, also visually in the 20s. So the question, internationalism, nationalism, so I would ask, of course, Peter about that, and I would ask Katya, because she also kind of thematized that.
Well, the thing is, Boris, you know that the only thing we really agree about is Alain Badiou. So, insofar as we both agree about him in a fairly extreme way, we don't really need to talk about him. I mean, Alain Badiou is not really the issue. The question of nationalism and the question of communism. I mean, I think there's a couple of difficulties here. The first is, I think that tradition. I think that there is an obligation within that very broad political tradition, which includes all the internal multiplicities that you're talking about, to be a national nihilist, right? There's a sense in which, outside of the brief moment of the world anti-imperialist nationalist movements, which is a very conjunctural, at least theoretically strategic nationalism, that it's very hard to conceive of a national identification as anything in the context of such a politics but reactionary. Yeah, that's the first thing.
Well, but simply a question, maybe relating to what Katya said, and questions that I had, as I was listening to you. Let us look at the socialist realism. Socialist realism was conceived an international movement. It was not nationalist, it was national nihilistic in the same sense. It was transported to China, it was transported to Korea. I know that they organized now exhibition of Korean socialist realism, transported to other countries, and we have also interesting socialist realist art in Italy.
I rather like socialist realism. My views on socialist realism are rather strange, but that's not the issue.
So is it... No, just a moment. Is it Russian or is it communist? What is about socialist realism? Is it Russian or is it communist?
Well, it certainly isn't specifically Russian because there's Chinese socialist realism. No. Socialist realism is not specifically Russian, but it doesn't follow from the fact that something is not Russian that it is necessarily good.
No. But is it communist? Is it communist? Because you said that constructivism was communist. A communist is probably kind of good. Yeah. But in this context. But is socialist realist also communist?
But this goes back to
it is not.
The question of communism, because in a way I think that there's a big difference in the way that the word communist signifies to people with different histories in relation to these political systems, because essentially in the West, and with the Western identification with the Soviet communist avant-garde of the 20s that I'm talking about, not the earlier one, communism is a political affiliation associated with a particular form of anti-capitalism, right? It's a specific way of being anti-capitalist. Communism as, if you like, an achieved social form, or rather the name for a social form, which is itself interesting because it's the name for a social form, but it doesn't describe the social form. It names the social form with respect to the state it wished to later achieve but never did. But the problem is for the people living in those societies, the word came to signify as a description of the society, hence, if you like, communist Russia. Mm-hmm. Right? So there's a slippage in the signification of the term because the social system, right, is not the communism which that system was aspiring to achieve. So there's two different uses of the term, and some of the confusion here derives from associating communist in its futural sense of the 20s that I'm talking about with communist in its 1950s Brezhnevian sense or something like that. Later, that as an achieved state, and that's if you like, that's a different use of the word, and I think that in a way you're hung up with that use of the word.
Well, look, I'm actually agree with Charles, because I had a feeling he thought absolutely in the same direction. As he said that the progressive art in the West is very much more like socialist realism, as is actually avant-garde of the 20s. Because it's mimetic, it's critical, and it's educational. And actually, socialist realism was not a mimetic art that reflected socialist conditions in the Soviet Union, but it was educational art, educational art that educated people toward communism. So in that sense, it was as futurist, as future-oriented as maybe future was, and maybe more. And so it seems to me that maybe the exclusion of socialist realism from this paradigm is unfortunate. Unfortunate in a way that it makes you blind for certain analogies with what I would characterize as second stage.
But I'm not excluding socialist realism. I just haven't given you an analysis of it today.
Yes, I know. But the point is that I saw this kind of parallel between internationalism being good and so on.
I've written about it. My view is that, for example, socialist realism in China is the first modernism in China.
Oh, yes, it is. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And as a modernism is defensible.
Yeah, absolutely.
In China.
Yeah. But not in Russia. Oh, yeah, who knows, yeah. I think Katya would like to defend Russia. Or maybe not. Or maybe not.
In fact, I had several different comments because everything was so stimulating. Of course, I agree with Charles and you that critical art is a kind of socialist realism today, which is not necessarily bad. Not just because of what you just said, because it's didactic and other things, but also because even if many people think otherwise, it has no quality. There is no difference between good critical art and bad critical art, believe me. And there is not intended to. Or there are some works which transcend this paradigm and go in another direction, avant-garde or whatever, it might happen. But what is normative being understood as critical art is not supposed to have any quality. And another thing, it cannot have any audience, in the sense it cannot have a spectator. Because this art does not give a place for the spectator. Either you are part of a group or you are not. I was supposed to show a fragment of film of Что делать, and there was no time, where they try to reenact a Soviet painting. It's a very simple painting. Yeah, it's upstairs. It's a very simple painting where people are staying like that. And during 8 minutes, they try to do it and they cannot. Yeah, they fussle a lot. So because they are supposed to be an open group, always in dynamics. Yeah, so they can't just stand quiet and represent this painting. Actually, why? Because there is no spectator who could tell them, stay this and you stay like this. Yeah, because there is no one. Everybody who who was in this scene has to be involved. And when everybody is involved, so it's art which does not give any place for the spectator. But the difference is that the Soviet socialist realism, or let's say Soviet avant-garde, which started this practice, was really aiming at transforming the audience of spectators into audience of artists or political participants. And partly they succeeded in it. And when I was reading and studying materials of Cultural Revolution time, we really see, people's lives changing because of art. For good or for bad, it's difficult to say, because I made an exhibition about a group far away from Moscow where one artist, trained artist, made artists out of local people, and he took one guy which was from national minority, deaf and dumb, and uneducated. And he made artists out of him. He became artist, then he went into Leningrad, he studied further, and became a kind of local star. He became a president of a society of deaf and dumb artists. Because of that, he was, of course, shot in 1937. Yeah, so that's the question, what art does to people. Yeah, but it was, real life. It was time of a real life, which is not the case with critical art. Yeah, critical art only works for the audience which is now here. Yeah, for the very small circle of critically minded, art people. And the pieces like Studielist is only meant to people who are present here now. That's the difference.
So speaking about educational and general character of socialist realism, my last third question would be about education, because here are art writers, as I say, and artists sitting at this table, but all of us are teaching, actually. That's interesting, And we have some kind of, but you organized the school. No, And that is precisely my question. That was my question. Is this a different thing? It is the same thing. It is a change of things, from same things to different things and so on. So what it seems to me is that there is some kind of, it seems to me, it's obvious, of course, that there's some kind of movement of art system in general toward education. Education becomes more and more central topic, as a field of experimentation, as attempt to establish art as a university discipline, and also, as we heard today, art as a kind of medium for certain knowledge, as you acquired in Yugoslavia and you brought to us, a certain knowledge that is not information about that, a knowledge of different kind, certain artistic knowledge, that you can't get different way. So what I would like to ask Tanya, because I had also asked Claire to personal experience at Tychikal Hill School, what do you think about real this kind of, and Anton make parallel things, what do you think about this intersection between education and art used as education, education understood as art practice, this kind of interesting symbiosis, and the same thing to you, what was a problem of knowledge and activation, and how it changed our knowledge and produced new knowledge. So this kind of relationship between art and knowledge and between art and education. So I would like to have comment on that. Maybe Tanya, you start.
I don't like
I know.
I don't like. Yeah. Well.
That's important. You just say you don't like authorship. Why?
I know.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I think the reason for doing the school were very, very clear politically. They were not so clear artistically, but I was very sure it was an art piece. And it was for me a way to prove to myself or to try to see if it's possible to change stuff through art. And in this case, I wanted to create a new kind of environment in the art world in Cuba, because the market has arrived. So everybody thought that, I mean, it was a group of us who became a little more international, quote unquote, and everybody thought what we have to do is kind of like flash art or something like that, like magazine. And everybody was more interested in money than actually creating this kind of critical or reflective about Cuba. So I wanted to start the dialogue, and I started with the young people, the only people I thought they would listen, you know. And I think they were pretty good. They're very, very good artists. You work with some of them, both of you. And I think it was very important for me also in that piece to negotiate authorship. And I'm still doing that. Because, for example, I was invited now to the Liverpool Biennial, and I gave my space to them. So I'm the curator of a show, but they're going to do the work. So it is a very tricky situation, negotiating authorship in this kind of project of education where you play with democratic situation in education. I don't know.
Education is always kind of not quite democratic thing at the same time, yeah, because if you educate people, it's not 100% democratic
it's an illusion.
Practice, yeah. Or maybe it is. Or maybe it is, yeah. I mean, yeah.
In the case of my project, it was half and half, because I brought people I knew they should listen to, and some other people I invited because they needed to, and they wanted to hear it from, so... I don't know. I just had a little criticism of something I was trying not to say it, but I'll say it. Which is that I'm very, very happy I closed the project, because now everybody's doing art as education project. And I think this is the big danger I see in the West, which is everything that comes from an urgency and a real need, social, political, personal, becomes a form or a system. Or something that can be reproduced ad infinitum with no actual being grounded in a real necessity, something at stake from it. So I don't know. I might be wrong. Other people can react to what I said now, but
maybe try to answer your question. Maybe also to answer your question, maybe a little bit. What we were, or maybe where that project derived from, separate from the year of research and involving ourselves in that situation, I think was also very much, let's say, looking at the environment of New Belgrade and observing the immense changes that had been accelerating since 1989. So since the changes. And we were actually very shocked, not only in Serbia, Belgrade, but also in different other countries, or maybe shocked is the wrong word, but we observed, let's say, how immensely quick the capital moved in, how immensely quick, let's say, different buildings in New Belgrade changed from being a huge community center into being a bank, being a government building, into being well, in the case of the hotel, which had a hotel for many meetings for leaders, into a casino, etc., etc. And that's the very big and obvious things. But also, I think, on a very daily street level, in that sense. So, what we actually wanted to do with that project was not so much, let's say, to educate the people, to tell them about their country, because probably they know more about it than me, I assume. Well, not maybe not. I think there's different levels of how a work, let's say, can come about, and I think the experience that we created through reactivating that platform that was sort of laying there for so many years, moss and so on, totally deserted, was actually to sort of bring in maybe these questions, but maybe more important to bring in the element of time, so that people come, maybe come to an area because they are called to come, and they don't find the answer to why they are called there. So it's kind of undecisive, and I think that undecisiveness was for us actually really what it was about, because it wasn't had the whole research, but also, let's say, looking at that place for us was not so much of saying, oh, this is that, and then therefore the answer is that or something. You know, it's sort of a more undecisive vacuum, and maybe it posed different questions to us, I would say. For example, why can't there be a Museum of Revolution there, apparently, or why don't we have a revolution, or what is it actually, all these kind of things. And I think that let's say that project asked these questions on very different levels just by creating this experience, or this kind of vacuum of spending time, you know, moving in and moving out. And then when we were making this film and presenting it in different ways, which actually is continuously changing, because one time we have presented it as a film which included also a lot of waiting with empty space, so to say, and now we are creating, working with people on this core. I don't think it's so much about educating, but it's more about really asking where does action take place. If I look at the Netherlands today, and actually this morning I wrote a very small article, or read a very small article, I didn't really read it, about Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who said that Wilders was actually very good for the country because it allows people to vote instead of to canalize their anger, let's say, in voting, instead of canalizing the anger in fighting. I'm not sure about that, but so that's maybe a slight answer to your question.
So it's a different kind of urgency. No. Yeah. Yeah. Well, yes, but I had a maybe you respond and then.
Yeah, no, maybe I just want to sort of defend the fad. It is a fad for educational activities as art in the West at the moment, but I want to get away maybe from the romanticism of, in the non-West it's really urgent and in the West it's mere form, because I think that's also a little bit misleading. There are different contexts, there are different impetuses, and maybe one reason that this is, I think there are several reasons why this is happening this decade. One of them I think is art historical. One is it's artists wanting to provide high density of content in projects that were sort of, let's say, merely convivial or relational in the 90s. It's a desire to bring content into that. And education is one mode of turning discussion into discussion about something. And then another mode is what's happening in education over the last 10, 15 years, and what has been called academic capitalism, the bureaucratization and total administration of education, and particularly I think this is felt particularly painfully in art schools, where this incursion of the profit motive and has become very damaging, and there's now a sense that education is no longer the free space of experimentation, the place you could go to for 3 or 4 years and just kind of kick around and think about stuff, has absolutely gone, because as soon as you're having to pay for your education, it reconfigures the student mentality into one of consumerism. And am I doing the right thing? Am I going to get the right grade? Am I going to get a job afterwards? How am I going to pay off these debts? And I think this is a real pressure that artists who are also involved in teaching also respond to this pressure. So there's two things. There's kind of the artist motivation, and then I think the curatorial motivation coming along with that informs, say, something like the Academy project you did with Irit Rogov, where curators and academics are very sensitive to this, combined with artists being very sensitive and feeling this closure of education as a space of free experimentation, and that has led to the explosion of artists doing art as education in the current decade.
Well, maybe then, but I really actually wanted also to respond. Yeah, to respond at the same point. Yeah, what Tanya said, I had the impression that this urgency is of much more general kind. Yeah, and it's not reduced to some kind of specific places, but it's kind of widespread in general, at least in two senses, so maybe in three. First of all, we are not educated about ourselves, and we are not self-educated, so to say. We don't know what we are doing, yeah, and we don't know what other people are doing. So this kind of conversations makes clear to us, to ourselves, what we're actually doing. The second, very important modernist and avant-garde impulse is manipulation, yeah, manipulation of the public, yeah. So if we look at avant-garde writing, yeah, from Italian futurism, Russian futurism, Dada, and so on. So everything was about moving from the production of something that is presented to a neutral, abstract public, yeah, to creating the public. So not creating the products for the public, but creating the public. Creating the spectatorship. Spectator itself is not seen as something automatically given. If given, then it's consumerist, capitalist attitude. So to break this consumerist attitude, I have to change the relationship to the spectator, and that means to educate in a certain way, in a sense, to bring the spectator in a different relationship to your own work, yeah. And this kind of urgency has been persistent, yeah, through the whole history of 20th century. And we had this conversation with Anton as he organized this project of Manifesto on Cyprus, where it was obvious that in a situation of ethnically divided country, yeah, the only way to, and it didn't work out, yeah, but the way to transgress this kind of thing is not just to show something, yeah, and wait for two different ethnically codified reactions to that, yeah, but to try to create a kind of zone, yeah, that would transcend this kind of division. And in a very, very strange way, I remember how it happened, yeah. This kind of locally urgent project suddenly became to be interesting to a lot of people, yeah. So maybe, Anton, you say something also about that, because it's also your experience.
Yes, I think, for us in the beginning, and this is going back to 2004, I was working on this project with two other partners, Maya Boel-Dahab and Florian Waldvogel. The idea really was a response not so much to a desire to educate, but more to a kind of banalization of the biennials of exhibitions and a kind of a crisis that existed not in the educational sphere, but in the sphere of particularly international large-scale exhibitions of art. We felt that the digest of biennials became so formulaic, it was constant reshuffling of more or less the same group of participants at different locations, similar themes, etc., etc. So we kind of wanted to try to think of a way to take the resources of the situation, the budget, the network, all that comes of it, and try to make it a little bit more productive, and particularly in the case with Manifesto, which is a kind of a moving exhibition, it never stays too long in any particular place. We really felt that the spectacle of a biennial exhibition on Cyprus would not have been particularly interesting or productive. And if it was possible to do something a little bit more long-term that could have longer-term consequences or development, that would just be a much better way to make use of the situation of this resource. And then, of course, as it was cancelled and as all of these things came up, for me it was also a little bit of a project maybe of a radicalization of a certain way, because it's not so, simple to just kind of go through all of this and, we were fired, people sued us, it was really ugly. Of course, there are always these moments when you kind of have to make a choice, like, well, do we play along? Do we actually deal with the situation rhetorically? Do we go through with this event in a completely compromised way, but pretend that we didn't? So of course a lot went into it, and so by the time the whole thing fell apart, it was I was already radicalized enough to try to do it independently with Boris and Martha and Liam and other people, which probably wouldn't happen previously. So there was a kind of educational process built in trying to set up the educational process, yes.
I think we had a certain kind of discussion, and I would open the discussion to the public because we have some time. I think we have another half an hour, as I heard. And that, so I would encourage you to direct a question to the panel or individual participants.
I have a question for you, Boris. I've unfortunately missed your talk yesterday, but I had a quick look through the paper that I received, and I saw that you're talking about Malevich and suprematism. So my question is about, recently I came across this, that Malevich was deeply influenced by Gurdjieff's mystical teachings, and that some of you can know from Uspansky's In the Search of a Miraculous, or Peter Brook's movie Meetings with Remarkable Men. And I wanted to find out when exactly he became influenced, because his teaching, or at least to us, became known quite late. They became recorded. So did he become familiar with it when there was Gurdjieff's group in Moscow? That's one question. And since we've been talking a lot about education, it's something that Gurdjieff had a particular look at education, where he believed that education is elitist. So, and he believed there is a very small, he looked at it as there's a small amount of education, and you cannot give it to too many people, because then you cannot share it between too many people, because you're going to water it. Therefore, you have to make sure that people who receive the education are those who deserve it and who would use it well. There was one way of looking at education for him, and the second thing was that he believed that experience and knowledge you have to have an equal amount of experience and knowledge to be able to use education as well. So therefore he didn't believe in educating, but he believed that people have to come to him to be educated. And another thing as well is that I'm guessing that for you, Anton, he should be ultimate hero, because I see lots of parallels between Gurdjieff and yourself. He came from the east to the west. He was somebody who was very busy working outside of the certain structures, and he kept himself very busy, but never did very much work, and he always organized structures within other people's work, and he didn't do very much, and he became an extremely influential mystical teacher.
Well, I think it was rather a statement than a question, a kind of parallel statement, which I think could provoke a certain discussion about the influence of mystical and philosophical thinking on the early period of avant-garde. My guess is that among many other artists like Kandinsky and Mondrian, many others, Malevich personally was at least influenced by that. At least it's my impression. Historic knowledge indicates that. But so I would rather encourage you to make a commentary on the questions that obviously related to more related to this discussion. Yeah, please.
I have had the chance to write down the question because I have this computer here, and the question is directed to Claire Bishop, because I have also had the chance to go through texts of yours, so thanks for the intervention today. They clarified some other things I've came across previously. And the question is, if a lot of the socially engaged practices, to call them like that, of the past decades have ended up coinciding or maybe being a counterpart of the ongoing capitalist discourse on creativity, and on the other hand, as in the example you showed here, there has been a production of art that highlights the criticalities in a lot of so-called socially engaged art, interpreting those practices sometimes. How would you position those practices, the practices by artists that, even if positioning themselves as producer of social empowerment, have chosen to play in that antagonist side that you mentioned, and quoting Marion van Osten, through those sort of fight-specific practices that are developing within a specific micro-world representative of the issues of contemporaneity, like a neighborhood can be. And I'm thinking to, for example, Park Fiction, or I'm thinking to Atelier d'Architecture Autogérée, or Isolar Center, to name some of the examples that have worked in the frame of a neighborhood.
Okay, can I just be sure I've understood your question, right? You're asking me...
How would you position those kind of...
How do I position them? Well, Park Fiction, and who are the others?
Atelier d'Architecture Autogérée.
I'm afraid I don't know that one.
Okay. Or maybe Isolar Center in Milan. Since it's an experience I come
How
from.
would I position them? Like on what chart am I pinning them? But I personally, I don't find Park Fiction very interesting. I think this is an activist project in which artists, musicians, poets have mobilized themselves to defend an area of Hamburg that was about to be gentrified, and good on them. You know, that's been achieved. But I'm not sure what's gained by putting that in an institutional museum context, as Okwi and Weza did in Documenta 11. You know, for me, there's always the question of, when it comes back to this question of where is the spectator, and how is that information, how is that process then translated to a secondary audience? And I think the space that exists in Hamburg is complete, speaks for itself, rather than needing to be mediated as an ideal model or example to other people through the museum. In general, I tend not to like works of art that are exemplary models. Yeah, this which is the Benjaminian model, which is idea which has been so influential since the 30s.
Actually, speaking democratically, I would include the panel into the notion of the floor. And so if somebody among you also would like to comment on or ask other participants, I would encourage you to do too. So not on the listeners, but maybe also you too.
I have a question to you. Possible. It's just from the beginning of our panel. Actually, and there is one thing I disagree. You told that it's not that I disagree, simply wrong. You told us that avant-garde is our antiquity. No, it's not true. Modernism is our antiquity, because modernism can be understood as a style. In this sense, as antiquity, we can refer to these modernist buildings as something beautiful as Parthenon. And then my question, avant-garde is not a style. So what do you think, you personally? Is avant-garde some gesture which is always the same? Or can we have different avant-gardes in different times with completely opposite gesture in relations to what is mainstream? Then we could probably answer the question you asked in the first place.
Well, first of all, style. For example, almost nobody who spoke, with maybe two exceptions, almost nobody who interpreted antiquity, Greek antiquity, interpreted as a style. Not Renaissance did it, not Nietzsche did it, nobody did it, yeah. So maybe Winkelmann did it, yeah, but it was a great exception. So, it is a certain disposition and a certain attitude that includes certain forms, includes certain aspirations directed toward nature, for example, if it's speaking about Greek antiquity. Certain general presuppositions about place of art in society, and so on and so on. So, that was Greek antiquity. Greek antiquity was not a collection of forms. Greek antiquity was a certain not collection, but a certain disposition. It was a certain attitude, certain mythology, certain practices, certain devices, certain forms, certain political expectation, certain understanding of nature, of human nature, and so on. So in this sense, avant-garde introduced different kind of understanding of nature, different kind of understanding of human nature, different kind of practices, different kind of relationship to the world. That is everything, of course, introduced by industrialization. Yes, I speak about avant-garde. Yeah, I don't. This difference between avant-garde and modernism was invented by a couple of authors in the 60s, and that's interesting difference. Berger actually almost never use Russian avant-garde examples, but mostly Dada, German Dada, and French Surrealism. He's actually a specialist in French Surrealist literature, and so on. So we have this kind of differentiations. We have non-differentiations, where we are moving in the same area, if we speak about. Also, if we try to oppose modernism, avant-garde, we are in the same area, we are in the same disposition. We only take a certain polemical position inside it, but we're moving in the same field. Now, the question is if we're moving in the same field. I listen, if I may really answer your question, I don't know, I give you a shot. Then what's interesting was for me to listen to Claire and how Claire made a quotation from Marx, which is a quotation from Greek-Roman antiquity. So people fishing, hunting, and criticizing. That was actually people did in Greek-Roman antiquity. And they did something completely different here in the industrial age and in the avant-garde. And the difference between our understanding of art and understanding of Marx is that Marx thinks that fishing is one thing and making art is another thing, but we are not very sure about that. So there is certain change. There is certain change, there is certain shift, and this shift on all the levels, levels of practice and attitude, psychological makeup, social role, and so on. That is very, very deep. So the question is, the question was, do we have a second paradigm shift? And I would say also no, if you want my opinion on that. Anton said no. So we listened to Peter because Peter wanted to say that also that what I say is all wrong.
I just wanted to say that the conceptual distinction between modern and avant-garde is already established in the mid-19th century. I mean, it's already there in the difference between the history of the two concepts and the emergence of a distinct concept of the modern in Baudelaire, which is not an avant-gardist concept, but which is completely alongside, a concept of avant-garde. So I think conceptually, right, that they are simply quite distinct. I want to say something about this quotation from Marx, just in passing, because this quotation from Marx is always cited in weird ways. What people forget about this quotation from Marx is that he's partly replying to Stirner, and he's referring to a passage in Stirner. And essentially, the point of this famous and rather over-literally taken passage in the German ideology is that Marx is saying what Stirner wants the individual to be under communism, everyone will be. And he's more or less repeating a passage in Stirner. So it's not that Marx has made up this thing about fishing and hunting or whatever. It's a specific textual reference to Stirner. And the point of the passage is to say, Stirner has an individualist concept of freedom, but everything that Stirner says the individual can do, all individuals will be able to do under communism. So that passage has actually been misread historically in a kind of weird way, whereby we now have 150 years literature on hunting and fishing as the primary activities of communism, which is just a complete red herring.
Maybe a small anecdotal comment to what Peter just said. I'm teaching now at Pittsburgh University, and I asked a colleague of mine what is his field of interest, and he said it's early modernism. And I expected also maybe it's Baudelaire, something like that. So what specifically? I said, no, early modernism, so 14th century, yeah, les anciens et les modernes. Yeah, so the dates of modernism and avant-garde, probably it was avant-garde also at that time, can be set in different ages. I think what the problem is and how we use today the notion of modernism, avant-garde. I agree, yeah, that the concept of avant-garde emerged in a certain Saint-Simonist circles, yeah, that was not the same as modernist and so on. But as we use that, it's a polemical. So conservative kind of part of it and commodified part of it is modernism, and progressive part of it is avant-garde. It's kind of usage, yes, of our days. I don't know even that this usage need any specific historical legitimation. It's just how we use words, yeah. But we use words in the same paradigms. That's what I want to say.
But I was going to say, I think there's a particular problem in English, which is to do with the fact that the term that is predominant in German throughout most of the texts that are cited in these debates in the post-war period is simply der Moderne. It's not modernism. Throughout Adorno's aesthetic theory, even the retranslation, throughout Benjamin, even in the new selected works, every time Benjamin says the modern, translators say modernism is simply a mistranslation.
That's true. Well, I think there is some kind of readiness in the public to finish our discussion. Yeah, I feel a kind of tiredness. Has somebody urgent questions? No. So I think it's good time to say thank you to the participants and to disperse ourselves in waiting for new event that would teach us something else. Yeah.